Donald Trump's feud with the leaders of some of America's longtime allies will be up close and personal today. The U.S. president has arrived in Canada for the beginning of the G7 summit, and Trump can expect a confrontation over trade and the stiff new tariffs he's imposed. Trump was welcomed to the summit with a handshake by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Earlier, Trump solidified his solo status on the world stage as he left the White House this morning, lashing out at his host and other G7 leaders over their strong criticism of his trade policies. Trump threatened to terminate NAFTA again, singling out the Canadian dairy industry.
We have massive trade deficits with almost every country. We will straighten that out. And I'll tell you what, it's what I do. It won't even be hard. And in the end, we'll all get along. But they understand, and they're trying to act like, well, we fought with you in the wars. They don't mention the fact that they have trade barriers against our farmers. They don't mention the fact that they're charging almost 300% tariffs. When it all straightens out, we'll all be in love again.
Joining me now from the G7 Media Center in Quebec City is the CBC's Katie Simpson, and in our Washington bureau, Ellen Morrow. All right, so let's start with you, Katie, and the widening trade dispute. Do you think there's a big confrontation brewing, or are they all in love again, as Trump says?
I don't think they're all in love yet. Certainly Justin Trudeau and some of the other world leaders who are frustrated with Donald Trump's trade policy would love to be in love again. So that's not a goal that's not shared by others here. But what we can expect this afternoon, there are a couple of working sessions that these G7 leaders will be taking part in. The first one is sort of a sit down to talk about the economy, but that's not really going to focus much on trade. What I'm told by my sources who know what's happening behind the scenes, it's the second working session where these world leaders who are frustrated by Donald Trump's decision to put tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, that will be their opportunity to have a blunt and frank discussion with Donald Trump about his decisions. I'm told it's not expected to be an intervention-style gang up on the president, but rather a forum where they can be blunt and frank with the U.S. president about what they don't like about his tariff policy and why it will hurt their country, in addition, why they believe it'll hurt the American economy. Justin Trudeau will have an opportunity to make that direct pitch to Donald Trump alone this afternoon. He's one of two of these leaders to get a bilateral meeting with Donald Trump. The other is French President Emmanuel Macron. However, that meeting is sort of in limbo right now. It's not canceled. I don't want to say that. It's not canceled, but it got delayed and pushed back, and now the American officials are trying to find room for him. So there's a lot of sort of moving parts behind the scenes right now.
And what's interesting about all of this, Ellen, is that while, of course, here in Canada, Katie is focused on the relationship or the trade dispute between Canada and the United States and the other G7 leaders, there's also internal reaction where you are in Washington, in the United States, about Trump's actions against its key allies. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that's right. President Trump, when he sort of appeals to his base with these tough on trade sort of moves, he does have supporters who like the president's tough rhetoric, followed in this case by tough actions. But there have been a lot of critical voices on this as well, particularly even from his own party. Republicans have come out and said we don't want a trade war. These are protectionist trade policies that will not benefit America. Obviously, from the Democrats, that there have also been that same level of criticism. And it's not just a political reaction. We've had manufacturers, farmers, people who Trump, who voted for Trump, possibly, who Trump wants to appeal to. They've also come out and said these perhaps aren't the best way to go about this by targeting a country like Canada with these tariffs. So again, he does have his supporters, but there hasn't been a wholesale backing of what the president is trying to do here in the United States, to say the least.
And Ellen, and Katie, I'll get you to weigh in after Ellen does. But what's interesting all about all of this, and a lot of people have been making this comment, and Ellen, we've been talking over the last few days about Trump looking ahead to the summit in Singapore with Kim Jong-un, having friendly words to say about him, and then criticizing Canada, saying that the Prime Minister has been indignant. And then today, Ellen, we heard that Trump wants Russia to be reinstated, when it used to be the G8, to be reinstated. Tell us about how that's being received.
Well, President Trump, Andrew, as we've seen him do time and time again, sort of gives these impromptu press conferences as he leaves the White House and heads out to his helicopter on the lawn. And he did that this morning as well. And one of the headlines from this sort of scrum this morning was the president saying that he would like to see Russia reinstated, for the G7 to once again become the G8. Now, he also, in that same exchange with reporters, said he's Russia's worst nightmare, because he says he's been tough on Russia. But certainly him saying that Russia should be reinstated has raised a lot of eyebrows. Russia was sort of kicked out as a result of its annexation of Crimea. There's a sense that if you would reinstate Russia back in, that would be almost a reward for bad behavior, more or less. Also, when you think about what's happening here domestically as well, with the ongoing special counsel investigation into Russian election meddling, that you would have the president saying that Russia should be back in this prestigious group of countries. Here's what exactly President Trump said on that this morning.
Whether you like it or not, and it may not be politically correct, but we have a world to run. And in the G7, which used to be the G8, they threw Russia out. They should let Russia come back in, because we should have Russia at the negotiating table.
And so, Katie, how is Canada, how is Trudeau and other G7 members reacting to that?
From Canada, it's a hard no. From the European Union, it's a hard no. The only one who seems to be somewhat supportive of Donald Trump's suggestion, this off-the-cuff remark about bringing Russia back into this G7, make it a G8 again, is the new Italian Prime Minister, who said yes, he thinks that there should be more conversations to bring him back, and possibly some of the reasoning there is, you know, can you really fix things if you're not having conversations to try and remedy things? But from Canada's perspective, as long as Russia is occupying Crimea, which of course was the reason these leaders kicked Vladimir Putin out of the G8 in the first place, unless that changes, this is not going to be happening. At least Canada is not going to be advocating for it. The European Union had very similar comments today, describing what Russia has done in eastern Ukraine as illegal and provocative, and saying unless that behavior changes, and as long as Russia is occupying Crimea, no, they're not going to support that.
And Ellen, it's been interesting because, you know, as I've been watching and listening to Americans talk about all of this, they really do seem to have been taking stock of the idea that Trump seems to be alienating some of his closest allies in this feud, and yet warming up to what people would call autocratic regimes or autocratic leaders. And that does seem to be unsettling some people in the United States who have talked about this long-time alliance between Canada, Europe, and the United States.
That's right, and it's not really new. If you go back to last year, of the first few months of the Trump presidency, we saw him go to Brussels for the NATO summit, where he really just criticized all of these other NATO allies for not having big enough defense budgets. Last year's G7 summit, it was a similar thing where he was just not on side with his traditional allies, and we've seen that time and time again throughout the Trump administration. You think about comments he's made about different European countries when it comes to their policies on terrorism. I mean, there are a lot of examples where he's really spoken out against traditional allied countries, and perhaps there are, fewer examples of him speaking out against Russia, for example. So that's part of the reason why the comments this morning are raising so many eyebrows. And it's not just Russia. You think back to the press conference at the White House yesterday, where President Trump was speaking with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and they were talking about North Korea. And obviously President Trump wants the summit next week to be very productive. He obviously wants to go into that summit with as warm a rapport as possible with the North Koreans. But, he said that if things go well in Singapore next week, he could see a scenario in which he would invite Kim Jong-un to the White House. He talked about receiving a really warm letter from Kim Jong-un that he really appreciated. And then, a few hours later, really kind of going after traditional allies on Twitter Twitter. So it is quite a stark contrast.
It is, and I want to get both of you to weigh in on this. And Katie, you were watching this live as Trump was in La Malbaie, as he walked down the stairs and he was greeted by Trudeau. I think what was stark about it is that the leader who met him before in this photo op, if you will, was Emmanuel Macron. I mean, they've been pretty buddy-buddy over the past couple of days. Hugs and kisses with Macron and his wife, and then Trump and the body language. I mean, we talk about the handshake because that's been a story. It's how Donald Trump shakes hands or how other leaders shake hands with him. Tell me a little bit about what you felt, what you saw in that.
It is, but you have to remember when Europeans tend to greet each other, their history has demonstrated that there can be more touchy-feely than perhaps there would be with the United States. Just generally, Europeans are very warm and welcoming in some ways, and so that could have been part of that. When Angela Merkel arrived, she got a big hug and a kiss from Justin Trudeau, and Macron started laughing as he approached Justin Trudeau because they spent the last couple of days together talking about this big summit. Donald Trump did not travel with his wife Melania, and so he alone walked up to the podium, seeming to take a look at all of the beautiful sights in La Malbaie, and it appeared, we couldn't hear it clearly, but it appeared that they were making some small talk about him gesturing to looking at how beautiful it was there. So all eyes were on that greeting because Donald Trump is walking into this summit with the possibility that he may be very isolated by his other G7 colleagues. And Donald Trump, as we know, he's decided he's not going to be staying for the entire summit. He's leaving early, and by leaving early, he's heading off to Singapore to go get ready for that summit with Kim Jong-un. But also by leaving early, that limits the amount of criticism he'll be able to take. It means less time for these leaders to be able to get one-on-one time with him to make their case on this. And so that's one thing to remember. One other point I want to make is that Donald Trump, before he even got here, he's standing on the lawn of the White House, sort of disrupting things before he even arrives, bringing up a new challenge like, hey, why don't we bring Russia back into the G7? We're going to fight for trade. These are all the big challenges, and that is what we're talking about at this point. That is not what Canada wants. Canada wanted to focus on its agenda for gender equality, for protecting democracy. And Donald Trump, with a few quick quips on the White House lawn, completely knocked that agenda off the rails.
So, Ellen, just a quick final word from you. So, am I torquing this? Is this about Europeans being warm and fuzzy and North Americans being a little bit more standoffish? Or, we've seen Donald Trump take Emmanuel Macron by the hand at the White House. We've seen moments where the president seems to show affection towards leaders, and then other moments where he just seems a little bit cooler.
That's right. There's that famous picture where he's walking on the White House grounds holding Theresa May's hand, I believe. So I think that, Katie's probably right. It is probably a European thing as well. But certainly this is extremely awkward. He called Prime Minister Trudeau indignant on Twitter just before, just a few tweets before this meeting. And the fact that we know he's leaving early, obviously he has a crucial summit coming up in just a few days with Kim Jong-un that he really needs to prepare for and be focused on. And that obviously is his perhaps more pressing focus at the moment. But the sense we have from what he said going into the meeting this morning, from a report in the Washington Post yesterday talking about the president's attitude, not just the Washington Post, CNN as well, with sources saying he really doesn't want to go. He just doesn't seem like he really, really wants to be there. He wants to get out of there and get on to Singapore.
Donald Trump is definitely a disruptive force at this year's G7. The other leaders do want to confront him, particularly when it comes to his trade policies and the recent tariffs. And the CBC's Evan Dyer is at the summit following this dynamic, and he joins us now. So, Evan, the other leaders all have disagreements with Trump. Who's likely to take the lead in challenging him?
Well, actually, it seems that it may have to be Justin Trudeau, at least in terms of one-on-one FaceTime with Donald Trump, because when he came here, he'd only scheduled 2 bilaterals. One was with Justin Trudeau, the other with President Emmanuel Macron of France. That was supposed to happen about an hour and a half ago, Andrew, but because the president was running late, partly because he lingered on the White House lawn to make those controversial comments, he arrived here late too, and the White House had to reschedule that meeting. It's not clear it will happen. They say they're going to try to make it happen later in the day. So he's not meeting Angela Merkel, he's not meeting Theresa May, he's not meeting any of the other leaders, but he still has that 5 o'clock meeting with Justin Trudeau. There are, of course, group sessions where all of the leaders will have a chance to make their feelings known to Donald Trump. And we expect to see Emmanuel Macron be quite forward in that, because his Twitter account over the last 24 hours suggests that he wants to be a protagonist in this effort to persuade Donald Trump to roll back the tariffs. He's been talking about the need to avoid the law of the strongest, and that the idea that the other 6 countries are based on values and that they will stand together if the United States president wants to isolate himself. But I think there's some question as to whether we can really see 6 countries here as a bloc against the United States, because they have differences. They're already being exposed by the comments about Putin, for example. We've seen Italy's new Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, immediately batten onto those comments and support them. Those are not comments that are supported by other members of the Group of 7. They're opposed by Theresa May. We've seen Canadian officials also say that's a non-starter as long as Russia remains in occupation of Crimea. European Commission President said the same thing. So there are splits on those issues. On tariffs, they're more united in that they all support a trade-based system. But these countries have not been hit equally by tariffs. Japan, which is a big steel exporter, sells almost all of its steel within Asia, and it feels fairly secure about its exports to the United States, which only represent 5% of its steel exports anyway. It believes it will get exemptions because it sells a kind of steel that can't be replaced in the domestic market, and the American importers have the right, therefore, to petition for exemptions. Japan believes that will happen. It cares much more about North Korea, and that's why Shinzo Abe went to the White House yesterday before coming here, and it depends on the United States to defend it. So there are leaders here among the G7 who care more about these tariffs than others. There are others who have priorities that they're going to put first.
So Evan, you're there. So what are your impressions? I mean, in terms of the atmosphere, Donald Trump is there. We watched the photo op. We've watched some of these moments. There are people speculating that he really doesn't want to be there. He's focused on Singapore. What is your impression of the feeling of what it's like to be at the G7, at La Malbaie, the president's first time in Canada, with these frayed relationships?
Well, I thought that the body language between the president and Prime Minister Trudeau and his wife looked friendly, and there was an effort, and we expected to see an effort from Justin Trudeau to keep this summit on the rails. He's also, while pushing back much more strongly in the last few days since Canada's exemption was taken away, he's also said we're not going to drop our cordial approach. So both from the point of view of being the Canadian Prime Minister and trying to defend Canada's interests, and from the point of view of being the host of a G7 summit that he doesn't want to turn into a disaster, Justin Trudeau is attempting to maintain good relations. And we've got to say, looking back over Donald Trump's history as well, he's often, let's say, tougher when he's tweeting than when he's face-to-face with other people. We may remember when he went to Mexico, for example, during the campaign, made no mention of the wall, but then the following night went to, I believe it was Phoenix, and held a rally where he led the crowd in a chant of build that wall, and said that he would make Mexico pay for it. So if you follow Donald Trump, we've noticed that when push comes to shove and he's meeting the people that he's been talking tough about on Twitter, sometimes the tone's quite a bit more gentle, but that doesn't mean that he won't go home and then pick up that old tone again. And that happened last year at the G7 in Italy, where shortly after returning to Washington, he pulled the U.S. out of the climate accord.
Now, with the G7 leaders on the ground in the Charlevoix region of Quebec, protesters are hitting the streets. Demonstrations began last night in Quebec City, about 150 kilometers away, and they continue today. The CBC's Salima Shifji is in Quebec City. So, Salima, today is being called a day of disruption by protest organizers. How is that shaping up?
Well, Andrew, it's a very fluid situation as protests sort of keep popping up, demonstrators moving through the streets of Quebec City. Just in the last hour, there was quite a tense situation. And of course, there is such a heavy police presence around here. As you can see behind me, it's just one example of how many different types of officers are here converged upon the city to keep track of those protesters. So there, as I mentioned, there was a bit of a tense situation in the last hour. About 100 or so protesters, perhaps a little bit more, ventured out really quickly into the streets of the city. They moved onto a highway. Riot police pulled out, blocked the highway, and the protesters, in fact, set fire to a futon couch in the middle of the road. That was quickly put out by police, but then the protesters split up in many different directions, taking to the streets, and it turned into a bit of a cat and mouse chase situation with the riot police moving through the tiny streets of Saint-Jean-Baptiste, an older neighborhood of Quebec City. So it was a bit of a chase. There was a police dog that came out as well, and we did see about 3 protesters being detained and taken into police custody. As I said, Quebec City Police, the SQ, the provincial police, the RCMP are here as well, all trying to monitor those protests and sort of trying to follow the ball and to see where the protesters are going, since they are not generally providing an itinerary when they move into the streets, and that is when the situations can get tense, when the riots, the demonstrations become illegal, in fact, when an itinerary is not provided to police. So heavy police presence here as this day of disruption continues, and little protests keep popping up along the streets of Quebec City.